Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to the late 1300s, where parchment crinkles beneath candlelight and the scent of boiled ink clings to every robe. You find yourself in Venice, not the gondola postcard version, but a city dripping with humidity, spices from the east, and the steady clatter of merchants shouting over one another in 6 different languages. You're not here to trade silk or haggle for pepper, though. No, tonight you're shadowing the soft, bookish rebellion of a girl who wasn't supposed to make history, but did. Not with a sword, not with a crown, with a pen. In a dim room just above a Venetian astrologer's study, you watch as a child's fingers smear ink across a half-finished scrap of parchment. There's no school bell, no blackboard. Just a father who thinks the stars can be read like verses, and a daughter quietly absorbing everything. You probably won't survive this, not because there's any real danger, but because your brain might fall asleep halfway through a sentence about medieval court bureaucracy. That's okay. It's part of the plan. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're watching from, and what time it is there. I love seeing the sleepy little history club stretch across time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Christine de Pizan is not yet Christine de Pizan. She's just a little girl named Christina, born around 1364. The air smells faintly of brine and ink. Her father, Tommaso di Benvenuto de Pisano, is a man obsessed with celestial charts and natural philosophy, a sort of medieval STEM dad. One minute he's calculating the trajectory of Saturn. The next he's interpreting omens in a client's urine. Multitasking, but what really matters to him is curiosity. And unlike most learned men of his time, he doesn't believe women are biologically incapable of understanding things. Radical, I know. So while most girls her age are being trained to supervise servants and embroider until their fingers go numb, little Christina is hovering around her father's study. She listens to lectures about planetary motion, the virtues of amethyst, and the medicinal uses of snail slime. She absorbs snippets of Latin the way you absorb background podcast chatter. Accidentally fluent. Historians still argue whether Tommaso actively taught her or just didn't notice she was learning. Either way, by the time she's 8, Christina can probably tell you which herbs to boil for melancholy, and she's suspiciously good at spelling. Then everything changes. King Charles V of France sends word Tommaso is invited to join his court in Paris. It's not just a promotion, it's an intellectual migration. Venice might be beautiful, but Paris is where ideas go to show off. You pack your imaginary travel cloak and follow the family as they shuffle onto a boat and then a caravan northward toward a city that smells like wet wool and ambition. Paris is a different creature. Gone are the sea winds and soft light. Now it's narrow alleys, high walls, and people who talk too fast. But for Christina, it's thrilling. Her father now works for the king. There are lectures, royal libraries, and astronomers who debate each other with dangerous politeness. You sneak into the royal library behind her quietly. Christine's eyes go wide as she looks around. Shelves upon shelves of books chained to the walls like prisoners too precious to be freed. Historians note that Charles V had over 1,000 books, an absurd number in an era where copying a single volume took months, sometimes years. To Christine, it must have felt like walking into a cathedral made of thought. And yet, for all this intellectual abundance, Christine doesn't go to school. Because, of course, she's a girl. She learns anyway. While her brothers go off for formal instruction, Christine lingers in the library, observes scribes, listens at doors. You trail her as she hovers behind desks, pretending to organize scrolls when she's really memorizing passages. One scholar recalls that she read so constantly that it seemed no hour passed without a book in her hand. That's not a compliment in 14th century France. That's a warning. It's important to pause here and realize how unusual this is. Most women in medieval Europe were illiterate. Even noblewomen rarely read, and those who did were often limited to religious texts. Christine, by contrast, absorbs philosophy, law, medicine, and poetry. She is, quite literally, building a mind the world has no use for. And then comes the court life. You float beside Christine as she's introduced to noble circles. The clothes are heavy, embroidered with thread made from crushed beetle shells and gold leaf. Her father has status now, which means Christine is expected to marry. Luckily for her, the match isn't terrible. In fact, Etienne du Castel, a royal secretary, turns out to be something rare in any century, kind, intelligent, and mildly amused by how much smarter his wife is than everyone else. Their marriage is a quiet partnership. They talk late into the night, exchange verses, and raise children amid the constant clamor of court intrigue. It's not romanticized, just stable. Like two candles burning side by side. Together, they defy the idea that intellect is unladylike, and for a few years, you think maybe the story has a happy middle. But life doesn't care about narrative arcs. In 1387, Etienne dies suddenly of the plague, a fever, or perhaps just too many court obligations. Records aren't specific. What matters is the shock. One day Christine has a husband, a household, and royal income. The next day, she's a widow with 3 kids, no property rights, and a stack of unpaid debts. She doesn't cry. At least, not in front of anyone. You sit beside her as she stares at a broken inkwell on her desk, wondering whether to pawn it or refill it. She chooses the second. It's the moment the story quietly shifts. Christine de Pizan will no longer be the daughter of an astrologer or the wife of a secretary. She's about to become a professional writer. Not a hobbyist. Not a courtier dabbling in poetry. A woman with no choice but to turn ink into bread. And the court is not ready. But we'll get to that soon enough. For now, you lean back against the stone wall of her writing room, hearing the muffled clatter of hooves in the street below and the scratch of a quill starting something new. You stay seated in that dim corner of Christine's modest attic writing room, where dust drifts slowly through a pale shaft of light from the single high window. Paris murmurs outside, but inside, the only sound is the steady scratch of a quill. It's early morning. The fire's gone out, your toes are cold. And Christine is already halfway through a stanza before the city's roosters have figured out what time it is. She isn't writing for pleasure, not anymore. She's writing for survival. Being a widow in late 14th century France is not a romanticized affair of black veils and poetic sorrow. It's bureaucracy. It's begging. It's being told by a court official that your husband's salary won't be paid because your documents are misfiled. Then being told by a cousin that you should marry again quickly before you lose all prospects. Christine says no. Politely. But firmly. What's fascinating here is that she doesn't just accept her new status as a social inconvenience. She turns it into a form of quiet defiance. While other widows retreat into piety or dependence, Christine borrows books. She takes jobs usually reserved for men, copying, composing, revising. She's not a noble lady playing at literature in her free time. She's an independent contractor with a quill and a deadline. She begins small. Occasional court poems, morning verses, letters. Most are written anonymously or under the assumption that the author must surely be male. One surviving note from a confused scribe reads, "The elegance is too practiced to be feminine." Christine chuckles to herself when she reads that, then keeps writing. She also begins collecting favors. Not political ones exactly, more like intellectual chits. The Duke of Burgundy, for instance, has a known fondness for allegorical verse. Christine sends him a small book of love poems, beautiful, technically perfect, and just ambiguous enough to flatter him without making promises. It works. He commissions more. And so, step by step, Christine builds something no woman had managed before her in France. A literary career. Historians still argue whether she saw herself as revolutionary. Some claim she just needed money. Others believe her sharp stylistic choices and moral themes were intentional acts of resistance. Maybe it's both. Maybe the rebellion is in the fact that she kept going, even when nobody wanted her to. As you watch her work, you start noticing how meticulous she is. She doesn't just write poems. She edits, revises, annotates. She hires scribes when she can afford them, but often prefers to copy things herself. Not for vanity, for control. A miscopied line could change the meaning of an entire stanza. And meaning for Christine is power. Her early poems are delicate. Lots of roses and courtly love metaphors. They fit the market which expects women writers, when they exist at all, to be sentimental. But even here, she's slipping in quiet barbs. In one verse, she compares a nobleman's love to a candle in wind. Pretty on the outside, but ultimately useless. The court finds her charming. They have no idea what's coming. You take a walk through Paris in your mind. The year is 1395. The 100 Years' War simmers in the background. Trade routes are tangled. And France is barely recovering from the last outbreak of plague. Most people are too busy staying alive to care about poetry. But in the courts of nobles and royalty, verse is currency. And Christine is starting to get noticed. One of her clients, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, becomes an early supporter. Not officially, there's too much risk in that, but Christine is invited to readings. She's allowed access to rare books. Quietly, she's given permission to matter. And in those smoky, silk-draped chambers, something shifts. Christine begins writing not just about love and longing, but about ideas, about morality, about power. Her language grows sharper, her illusions braver. She pens a poem about a knight who cannot find honor because all the roads to it have been deliberately hidden. The metaphor is not subtle. People whisper. You float back into her study. There's a new energy in the room now, urgency maybe. Her children sleep in the corner. The fire crackles. Outside, church bells toll midnight. And still she writes. She's working on a collection called Dit de la Rose. It's a clever, layered piece that does something unheard of. It critiques an extremely popular book. And this is where Christine stops being just a writer and becomes a critic. You may have heard of The Romance of the Rose. It was wildly famous, like the medieval equivalent of a viral Netflix drama, complete with moral confusion, pretty metaphors, and casual misogyny. The second half, written by Jean de Moon, is especially rough. It portrays women as manipulative, irrational, and defined entirely by their sexuality. Christine does not take it well. She responds with calm, beautifully constructed outrage. She doesn't just say it's wrong. She says it's dangerous, that it corrupts young men, that it paints women as less than human. And she writes this not in secret but in letters, open letters, which in medieval France is the equivalent of subtweeting someone in a royal banquet hall. Her critiques catch fire. Men respond. Clerics argue. Scribes gossip. One monk calls her a learned shrew. She adds him to her mental list of footnotes to destroy later. You might expect Christine to back off, but instead, she doubles down. She argues, in careful prose, that literature has consequences, that what is written in jest often becomes belief, that writers have responsibilities, even to people they dislike. These ideas are revolutionary not just for a woman, but for anyone in a world where the ruling elite treats art as decoration, not ethics. The debate becomes known as the Querelle de la Rose, the Quarrel of the Rose. It lasts years. Christine is, effectively, the first woman in European history to publicly enter a literary debate, hold her ground, and win respect doing it. And it's not because she shouted louder. It's because she argued better. She didn't rely on emotion. She cited sources, quoted Aristotle, interpreted scripture. She even managed to flatter her opponents while intellectually dismantling them. "Good sir," she writes in one reply, "your words are as sharp as a goose feather, but I fear they point in the wrong direction." By the end of the decade, Christine is no longer just a novelty. She is a force. She hasn't yet written the book of the City of Ladies. That's coming. But here, in these early court years, you see the architecture of that city begin to form. Not in brick, not even in intention, but in rhythm, in cadence, in the confident scratch of a pen that knows what it's doing. You lie down on the rug in her study. It's late. She's still writing. Paris sighs through its alleyways. And Christine, now in her 30s, now battle-tested and widow-strong, dips her quill once more and begins a new poem. This one starts, "All men say we're weak of mind, but still I write, and still I find." You wake to the soft rustle of parchment and the scent of warm ink. Christine hasn't moved. It's still dark in the room, though the faintest hint of dawn is peeking through the high, crooked window. She's bent over her desk, unmoving except for her hand, which guides the quill with quiet ferocity. You rub your eyes, stretch, and realize something has shifted, not just in her writing, but in the way the room feels. There's tension now, focus, confidence wrapped in modest wool sleeves. Christine is no longer just surviving. She's building. The Paris around her is still fractured. The court is still its usual theater of whispered betrayals and embroidered diplomacy. But Christine's poems are being passed from hand to hand, among nobles, scribes, and increasingly, among women. That last part? It matters, because up until now, literature in France has been something done to women, written about them, usually by men, and usually with all the subtlety of a drunk court jester juggling clichés. Women are depicted as temptresses, fools, saints, or background decoration. Nothing in between. Christine is not having it. You sit beside her as she assembles a new manuscript, carefully bound, her own verses copied and recopied, the margins filled with her neat annotations. She's preparing it for presentation, most likely to another noble patron. And it's here you realize, Christine isn't just writing books. She's engineering herself into the system that once ignored her. Her poems are no longer abstract exercises. They're letters with purpose, carefully crafted observations about loyalty, virtue, hypocrisy, and yes, still a healthy dose of love poetry, but with a twist. Take her poem 100 Ballads of a Lover and His Lady. Sounds standard, right? Romantic, predictable, except the lover is often wrong. The lady is frequently unimpressed, and the tone slides between sincere, biting, and quietly sarcastic. In one ballad, the lady essentially tells the suitor to take a long walk off a short drawbridge, and then critiques his spelling. You hear laughter. It's Christine. She's rereading that same ballad now, and for a moment, the tired lines of her face soften. It's easy to forget how rare female laughter is in these documents. Most preserved female voices are filtered through male scribes, religious texts, or court records. But Christine wrote herself in. Full voice, with rhythm, with jokes. One of her most subtle tricks? Gender inversion. In several poems, Christine takes common tropes, like the helpless damsel or the fickle flirt, and flips them. She gives the woman agency, then places that agency within the confines of courtly decorum, so it doesn't look like rebellion. It's like watching someone smuggle fireworks inside a prayer book. Historians still argue whether Christine was consciously feminist in the modern sense. Some say her work is too rooted in medieval hierarchies. Others insist she was decades, even centuries ahead of her time. But what's clear is this: Christine carved out a space for herself and others inside a system designed to exclude her entirely. You follow her through the halls of the Hotel de Nesle, where the Royal Library is housed. Her dress brushes the cold stone floor. She walks past guards who glance, then look away, unsure whether to greet her. She's not quite a noblewoman, not quite a servant, something in between. Inside, shelves creak under the weight of vellum. The air smells like leather, mold, and candle wax. You linger near the window as Christine browses. She's not here to read today. She's here to negotiate. She's brought a new manuscript, her first full-length prose treatise, La Vision Christine, a dream allegory, bold, rich with symbolism, and very pointed in its criticisms of corrupt officials and social injustice. The kind of thing that would normally get someone quietly removed from court invitations. But Christine couches it in metaphor. She presents herself as a humble dreamer, merely recording visions sent to her in sleep. A classic literary tactic, plausible deniability with a dash of divine inspiration. It works, the book circulates, and people notice. Soon after, she's commissioned to write biographies, tributes, and political allegories. One of her clients is Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Another is John of Berry, a great patron of the arts. These aren't small names. Christine isn't just publishing. She's entering the bloodstream of power, and she's doing it while raising 3 children, managing household expenses, and dodging the ever-present threat of war, plague, and scandal. You trail behind her on market day. The streets are muddy, the air sour with old cabbage and horse sweat. Christine haggles for quills, parchment, and candles. She checks the thread count on linen. She carries everything home herself. Back in her writing room, she lays out supplies like a soldier prepping for campaign. And that's what it is now. Campaign. Quiet, slow, but relentless. You read over her shoulder as she begins a new poem. This one starts with a garden. There's always a garden. But instead of a man wandering through it, fantasizing about women made of silk and sighs, Christine places herself in the garden. And she's pruning it. I remove the thorns, she writes, but leave the stems, for beauty And for truth, there it is again. The subtle jab, the reshaping, and while many of her critics grumble, one priest accuses her of meddling where nature forbids. Christine's popularity grows because she offers something rare, a female voice that is both graceful and sharp. Her readers are surprised to find themselves agreeing with her, even some men. You remember one letter she received, addressed with awkward reverence. To the Lady Christine, whose thoughts shame even learned monks. It's not quite a compliment, but it's close. At night, when the streets fall silent, Christine keeps writing. She begins drafting her next great project, though she doesn't yet know how important it will be. It's only a collection of sketches right now, a few stories, a few arguments, but the title already echoes through her mind like cathedral bells. La Cité de Dames, the Book of the City of Ladies, a city built by women, for women, constructed not with stone, but with words, fortified by the examples of real historical women, warriors, queens, scholars, saints. Christine will serve as both architect and narrator. And the gates? Wide open, but that's still to come. For now, you return to the present. You watch her blow gently on a drying page. She sighs, rubs her temples. The candle sputters, and you realize Christine isn't just rebelling. She's writing a new blueprint for what rebellion looks like. Not violent, not loud, but patient, clever, permanent, the kind of rebellion that sneaks into 1,000 minds and never leaves. It's early afternoon now. Sunlight slants through the window of Christine's narrow writing room, illuminating particles of dust like little golden ghosts. Outside, Paris groans and clanks with its usual chaos. Clattering carts, the ringing of distant bells, voices shouting in at least 3 different dialects. But in here, it's just you and her, the scratching of her quill, the faint creak of the old wooden stool beneath her, and the sense, ever growing, that something extraordinary is beginning to take shape. Christine is planning something. She sips weak wine from a chipped goblet, her eyes distant, her mind clearly building beyond the page. What she's sketching now is no ordinary book of courtly verse or sentimental tribute. It's something much stranger, much larger, and much more dangerous, because Christine is about to write herself into the role of creator. Not just poet, not just chronicler, but architect of an entire symbolic world. This is where the Book of the City of Ladies begins, not on parchment, but in thought. You sit beside her on the floor, legs stretched out, leaning against the cool stone wall as she outlines what sounds, at first, like fantasy. A city made of reason, justice, and examples of historical women. But this isn't escapism. It's armor. Because Christine is tired of being told what women are by monks, by scholars, by men who haven't talked to a woman who wasn't their mother or their cook. So she asks herself the most revolutionary question she's ever posed. What if women weren't the problem? What if the books were? And then she answers it, but not in a rant, not in fire, in structure. She begins by giving herself guides, 3 allegorical figures, reason, rectitude, and justice. They appear to her in a vision as women draped in robes, each carrying tools of construction, a mirror, a ruler, a square. Together, they instruct her to build a city, a mental refuge, a fortress of stories, examples, and intellectual brickwork to shelter women from centuries of slander. Christine listens. And she writes, the first walls of the city are laid with stories of mythic and historical women, Queen Semiramis, warrior queens like Penthesilea, philosophers like Hypatia. Some of them, historians agree, absolutely existed. Others, maybe not. And Christine knows that. But she also knows that the function of the story is more important than its strict factuality. Because the point isn't to prove women are good. The point is to show they have always been complex, capable, and silenced. She doesn't call it feminism. That word doesn't exist yet. She calls it justice. You float through the city in your imagination, walking between metaphorical towers and gates, each named after a virtue, each housing a new tale. Christine is the tour guide, the mason, the keeper of the keys. But let's not pretend this is some dreamy exercise. Christine is taking real risk here. By elevating female voices, she's implicitly challenging both the Church's authority and the philosophical traditions of Aristotle and Augustine, men who claimed women were spiritually inferior, intellectually weak, or biologically defective. Historians still argue whether Christine meant to push that far, or if her work was framed in allegory to protect herself. But her metaphors are too pointed, too specific. At one point, She writes that women have been maligned by those who fear what they cannot understand. A phrase so sharp you can hear it echo through the centuries. The court is curious. A copy of her draft makes its way to the queen's attendants, then to a duchess, then to a cloistered abbess who writes Christine a note thanking her for naming the unnamed. Christine never expected that, but now requests come in. Can you include the saint? What about this martyr? Did you know about the lady who defended her village from an invading army with only a kettle of hot oil and 4 geese? Christine smiles. She adds them, and so the city grows. What's fascinating is how Christine builds her arguments not just with praise, but with logic. She takes the same rhetorical techniques used by male theologians and turns them toward a new goal. For example, if women were truly as wicked as men claimed, she argues, how could God have made Mary the mother of Christ? If female nature is inferior, how do you explain women saints, women rulers, women scholars? These are not vague emotional appeals. They're structured like legal cases. And that's what makes them so subversive, because Christine is not asking to be admired. She's demanding to be understood, and she's doing it in plain, elegant French, accessible to those who didn't read Latin, including many educated women. That accessibility makes her dangerous to the gatekeepers of knowledge, who preferred truth to come in the most obscure, clerical language possible. Meanwhile, Christine is writing on boiled animal skin, her fingers stained black with iron gall ink, her back aching from long nights bent over the desk. She edits obsessively, sometimes redrafting a single passage 6 or 7 times. She's not just pouring her soul into the work. She's pouring in strategy, because she knows who might read it, and who might try to bury it. When the book is finally finished, Christine wraps the pages in linen, bundles them with a ribbon, and delivers them, personally, to a patron. Not with fanfare, not with ceremony, just a quiet, steady presence, and a smile that says, you're going to read this, whether you're ready or not. And they do. The Book of the City of Ladies spreads. It doesn't go viral. Nothing in 1405 does. But it circulates steadily through court libraries, abbeys, and private collections. Copies are made. Margins are filled with notes. Names of forgotten women are spoken again, sometimes aloud, and for the first time, Christine feels something almost alien. Satisfaction. You sit with her by the window that evening, sharing silence. She's tired, but not drained. Her hands are ink-stained, but steady. Outside, someone's playing a lute badly. A dog barks. A drunk sings half a chanson and forgets the rest. And Christine, ever the builder, starts thinking about her next project. Because cities need defenders. And the City of Ladies is not yet finished. The City of Ladies is complete. For now, Christine ties the final manuscript bundle with care and places it among the others. Not one copy, but several. She's overseeing scribes now. Handpicked, paid fairly, sometimes women. She trains them in precision, in elegance, in how to spot an improperly curved G. Because this city she's constructed, page by page, needs to be seen. Not once, not in passing, but again and again, across courts and convents, over decades and lifetimes. You trail her down the stairs to the street, where a courier waits with a wool-wrapped parcel slung over his shoulder. Christine nods to him, gives brief instruction. That copy will be read by someone important. Someone who may never admit what they learned from it, but someone who will never forget it. And now Christine breathes. She's not idle. She can't afford to be. But something in her posture relaxes. She no longer writes only to survive. She writes because her words have landed. And the ground didn't collapse beneath her. So what now? Now she sharpens the edge of her pen. Because the world is shifting, and Christine intends to shape how it's remembered. She begins a new project. Not allegory, not dream vision, but documentation. A compilation of historical women who defied expectations. A record, a mirror, a library of flesh and blood examples to stack up against centuries of erasure. This one is called The Treasure of the City of Ladies. You sit beside her as she sketches out the chapters. It's practical, almost alarmingly so. She offers advice for women in different walks of life. Nuns, wives, widows, courtiers, princesses. She doesn't romanticize. She warns. She encourages. She quotes history, but also gives deeply personal instruction. as if she's writing to a younger version of herself. One passage tells a young woman to speak rarely in public and only when necessary, not out of submission but strategy. Men cannot accuse you of foolishness, she writes, if they've never heard your voice except in wisdom. It's clever, it's careful, it's maddeningly relevant. Historians still argue whether Christine was empowering women within the system or simply teaching them to survive it. Her advice often walks a tightrope between resistance and accommodation. She tells noble women to be obedient, but also to educate themselves so they can advise their husbands. She tells nuns to be silent, but also to read widely and reflect privately. Her words are layered, tactical. This isn't rebellion with a banner. It's rebellion like a chessboard, and the court, still paying attention. Christine becomes something of a curiosity, respected if not entirely understood. Male poets and scribes attempt to mimic her style. Some fail, others succeed too well, and she responds with thinly veiled critiques about those who wear borrowed robes and expect praise. She's not afraid to bite. You follow her to a reading in a small hall lit by oil lamps and crowded with noblewomen in tight brocade. Christine stands in a modest gown, not richly dressed, but self-assured. She reads aloud from the treasure of the City of Ladies, her voice steady. You scan the audience. There are tilted heads, pursed lips, the occasional widened eye. A few women nod subtly. A few men look uncomfortable. One duchess whispers to another. She speaks plainly, but the meaning is not small. Exactly. After the reading, a young woman approaches Christine with trembling hands and a book to sign. She's barely more than a girl. Her father is a chancellor, and she's not supposed to be reading secular texts. But she found Christine's work hidden in her brother's collection. It was like hearing someone think the way I do, she says, then blushes and hurries away. Christine doesn't follow. She just smiles faintly and returns to her chair. This is what her words are doing now. Slipping into rooms she will never enter, into minds she will never meet. And yet, outside this fragile literary success, France teeters. The country is lurching between factions. The Armagnacs, the Burgundians, the Dauphin, the madness of King Charles VI, who sometimes believes he's made of glass and runs screaming from his own attendants. The plague flares again. Mercenary armies stomp through villages. Trade slows, and the church, still squabbling over who's actually pope. Christine weaves through this chaos like a thread through torn fabric. She refuses to take sides in the civil war, despite pressure. Her books end up in both camps. Some days that makes her smart. Other days it makes her suspect. But she navigates with precision, always returning to her one stable foundation, the written word. And still she works. She writes a biography of King Charles V, her father's old patron. She praises his wisdom, his love of books, his fairness. It's a calculated portrait, meant to remind future rulers what power should look like. And here, she includes one of her quietest but most radical arguments. Christine insists that a good king must listen to women. She doesn't phrase it that bluntly. She couches it in praise, in poetic framing. But the point stands. And in doing so, she inserts herself into a long tradition of royal advisors, without ever being officially granted the title. You walk with her back through the crowded streets of Paris. Beggars crouch near taverns. Street performers juggle while eyeing the guards. A priest preaches fire and damnation from the steps of a crumbling church. Christine moves through it all quietly, respectfully, but with that same air of inward clarity. She knows what she's doing, and then, just when it seems things might finally settle, a new figure explodes onto the scene. A young peasant girl, claims to hear saints, rides into battle in armor, fights for the Dauphin, wears men's clothing, wins. Her name is Jeanne d'Arc, and Christine, she pays attention. In a world where every woman who's ever been remembered had to first be doubted, condemned, or erased, Jeanne is doing the unthinkable, openly, loudly, and with a sword. Christine watches from her study as news spreads. Orleans relieved, English routed, the Maid triumphant, and for the first time in years, Christine feels hope. Real, burning, ink-deep hope. She reaches for her pen. A new poem is forming, but that's for later. Tonight, she simply lights a candle, holds it near the window, and whispers, "She is not alone." You return to Christine's writing room as the candle flickers low, casting strange shapes along the stone wall. Her fingers hover over the page, unmoving. The poem about Jean, about Joan, is still only a few lines long. But in those lines, something stirs. Something Christine hasn't felt in years. It's not defiance. She's had plenty of that. It's not grief or weariness or even resolve. It's permission. For the first time in her life, Christine sees a woman being treated like a hero while still alive. Not canonized, not married, not fictionalized into some mythic goddess. Just a girl, a French girl, standing in armor. She dips her quill and begins again. The poem takes shape in short, punchy lines, different from her usual careful stanzas. More breathless, as if her heart is catching up with her hand. She writes about Joan's arrival, about her visions, about the way she rode through battle like light itself. She writes about her clothes, not to criticize but to marvel. How strange, how thrilling, to see a woman in trousers command an army. And not from the sidelines, from the front. And here's the quiet subversion. Christine is not just honoring Joan. She's placing her inside the city of ladies, adding a new gate, one that opens, finally, onto a battlefield. Historians still argue whether Christine truly believed in Joan's visions or simply admired the strategy of them. But the poem, L'Odyssée de Jeanne d'Arc, is clear in its awe. She is sent by God, Christine writes, to save the realm and shame the wicked. It's a line that works both as prophecy and political commentary, because France at this point is not a country in the modern sense. It's a frayed tapestry of loyalties, duchies, and dynasties stitched together by war and inertia. Joan's arrival is like someone slamming a fist onto a chessboard mid-game. Everything scatters. Christine watches with cautious hope. The court buzzes. Some nobles sneer. Others listen. But none can ignore the girl in armor. Christine begins to imagine what it would be like to meet her, to ask her what courage feels like, to tell her, "I've been fighting too, just with different weapons." But of course, they never meet. Instead, you watch as Christine finishes the poem, ties it carefully in ribbon, and sends it to a noble patron. Spreads slowly. Nothing spreads fast in 1429, but it echoes. One scholar later writes that the poem raised eyebrows and spirits alike. And then, silence, because as Joan rises, Christine begins to fall silent. Not defeated, not broken, but tired. A different kind of quiet. Her work is nearly done. She's in her 60s now, older than many of the women she once profiled. The ink stains on her fingers are permanent. Her eyesight is worse, but her mind remains sharp. You sit with her one more night, wrapped in a blanket, as she reviews her old manuscripts. She doesn't read them like a proud author. She reads them like a mason checking the stability of old stone. She smooths a page from the book of the City of Ladies. Her fingers trace the margins. Where a scribe once doodled a flower beside Queen Zenobia's name, she smiles. She doesn't erase it. She opens Le Livre de Trois Vertus, the instructional follow-up to the city. There's a passage she lingers on, about how noble women must not only preserve their honor, but guard their minds as one would a fortress wall. She nods. It still holds up. Then she pauses on the poem for Joan. Her fingers tremble slightly. You wonder if she knows what's coming, because within a year, Joan is captured, sold, tried, burned. Christine is still alive when it happens. We don't know what she thought. She didn't leave a record. No more poems. No more treatises. Her pen goes still. Some historians believe she died shortly after. Others think she simply retreated into a convent, taking vows maybe, or just hiding in silence. You imagine her at a small window in some stone monastery, watching sparrows flit across the gray sky and whispering, "You were not wrong, Jean. They just weren't ready." And so, Christine vanishes. Not literally. Her books remain. Her name, too. But like a bookmark forgotten in an old volume. Centuries will pass before anyone opens it again. But even now, even here, you can feel the weight of what she left behind. Because Christine didn't just challenge ideas. She recorded them, preserved them, carved them into parchment and spine so they couldn't be erased just by opinion or time. And in doing so, she became something almost unheard of, a woman who defined her era on her own terms. You stand in her writing room one last time, smaller than you remembered. There's a faint outline of where her desk once stood. The plaster around the window is cracked. The stairs creak under your feet, but the silence feels full, not empty. Outside, Paris has changed. Horses replaced by wheels, torches replaced by street lamps. And in some quiet library, a student opens the book of the City of Ladies and whispers, "How did I not know this existed?" And Christine, wherever she is, smiles again. The attic is empty now. You return gently, almost tiptoeing, half expecting to see her bent over her writing desk again. Eyes narrowed in concentration, candle guttering at her side. But no, the dust is thicker, the air colder. Christine is gone, and yet the space hums, not with her voice, not anymore, but with the echo of what she built. Her city still stands, not in stone, not on any map, but in the minds of those who've read her words and felt something shift. You glance at the bundle of pages stacked neatly in the corner, the last copies yellowing slightly at the edges. No one has touched them in decades, but they wait patiently, like a gate with no key, just waiting for the right hands to push it open again. And the city they describe? Oh, it's still there. You imagine it now. Quiet towers rising in the early morning light, their windows facing east, the streets below whispering with the footsteps of women who've been dragged from history's margins and invited inside. Not worshipped, not put on pedestals, recognized, seen. The builders are philosophers, warriors, mothers, healers, rebels, and queens. You remember some of their names: Semiramis, Deborah, Sappho, Zenobia. But it's not about remembering all of them. It's about remembering that they were there. And Christine? She doesn't stand at the center like some monarch. She walks the perimeter, checking the foundations, adjusting the scaffolding, holding open the door, because that was always the point. You think back to the beginning, Christine's beginning. A girl with an educated father, plucked from Italy and dropped into the cold formality of the French court. A girl who married young, loved deeply, and then lost it all. A widow at 25, told to remarry, to fade politely into the background. But instead of fading, she picked up a quill. Instead of grieving quietly, she turned her sorrow into structure. You remember how she outwrote the men who mocked her, how she debated with clerics and scribes who believed women should not think, let alone argue, how she quoted Aristotle back at them, calmly, deliberately, like a librarian wielding thunder. Historians still argue about the extent of her influence. Was she read widely in her time? Yes. Did she vanish for centuries afterward? Also yes. Was her feminism accidental or intentional? That depends on whom you ask. But here's the thing, you don't build a city by accident. Christine's hands shaped every corner of it. She chose the stories. She laid the metaphors like bricks. She gave her city walls, but left the gates wide open. She knew who would try to tear it down. She prepared for that too. And perhaps more than anything, she believed radically, dangerously, that the mind of a woman was not just equal to a man's. It was hers, and worth defending. You leave the attic and step out into a world that Christine would hardly recognize. Paris is louder now, paved, crowded, but the bones are the same. The old stones still remember her. Some nights, if you walk near the Seine just before dawn, you might feel a gust of wind that smells faintly of ink and lavender. Or hear, in the back of your mind, the scrape of a quill and a line beginning to form. I write not for glory, but because silence is a kind of death. And that's the truth. Christine wasn't trying to be immortal. She was trying to be heard, to be a woman who thought in public, who argued in print, who refused to apologize for being intelligent, or critical, or alive. So the next time you sit down to read, or to write, or to think thoughts that feel too bold, too strange, too impossible, imagine her beside you. She's not holding your hand. She's holding the door, and she's saying, go on. You've got work to do. The city never really closes. Even now, you find yourself wandering its metaphorical streets, some quiet and tree-lined, others paved with strange ideas and unfinished thoughts. Christine's work wasn't a final product, not really. It was a blueprint, a dare, a whisper passed from one page to another, one hand to another, century to century. But here's the thing you begin to realize as you walk alongside her memory. Christine de Pizan didn't set out to fix the world. She set out to correct its lens, and her lens was sharply focused on memory. Memory is tricky in the medieval world. It doesn't always belong to the living. It belongs to parchment, to stained glass windows, to the stories the church chooses to repeat, and the ones it buries. But Christine makes memory democratic. She tells you about Hildegard and Blanche of Castile and the anonymous peasant women who held towns together while their husbands fled war. She doesn't just write their names. She lends them context, a voice, legs to walk through time with, and that changes everything. You stop at a corner of her imagined city. It looks like a library. No, more like a courtyard, where women from different ages sit at long stone benches, arguing, laughing, writing. A philosopher from Alexandria, a nun from Brabant, a queen from Nubia, and across from them Christine, not as a guide, but as another voice at the table. That's important. Christine never claims to be the first woman to think. She claims to be the first to record that thinking in a way that might survive. And that nuance? That's her genius. She didn't just lift up women from the past. She warned you that forgetting them was a choice. You lean against the imaginary city wall and think about what she was up against. In her time, every book had to be copied by hand. Every page was a risk. Even storing books was dangerous: fire, mold, theft. And for a woman to be involved in the creation of knowledge was seen, by many, as unnatural. Unnatural, that word haunts the margins of Christine's life. She was called too learned, too masculine in tone, presumptuous. Her very presence in literary circles was a threat to the established order. And her response? She wrote more. She kept writing even when the plague returned. Even when the war made Paris dangerous. Even when patrons changed allegiance or died, and manuscripts vanished into burnt libraries or political purges. She just kept going. At one point, she writes, "One must not be afraid of being seen with a pen." You picture her scribbling those words with a slightly mischievous smile, knowing full well how many people would frown at the very idea of a woman writing about writing. It's funny now, centuries later, to think how many things people considered unthinkable in her time. A woman owning property, a woman teaching, a woman speaking in public without being accused of madness or heresy. And yet Christine did all those things, quietly, strategically, through books. You return to the city, her mental city, and notice that it isn't finished. It wasn't supposed to be. Christine left space, blank stone walls, empty towers, untitled chapters. She left them for you, because the City of Ladies was never just a celebration of the past. It was a construction project that required more hands, more eyes, more stories. She built the foundations and then stepped back, not because she was done, but because she trusted that others would have to come, and eventually, they did. You think of Mary Wollstonecraft, centuries later, drawing lines from Reason to Rights. You think of Sor Juana, writing poetry in secret from a convent in Mexico. You think of modern voices, Sojourner, Audrey, Malala, each one pulling bricks from Christine's city to build their own. And Christine? She's not jealous. She's relieved, because it worked. In one of her lesser-known poems, Christine writes a few lines that hardly anyone quotes. But maybe they should. "Let it not be said that I wrote alone, but that I added to 1,000 voices, who whispered before me, unheard." That's the city talking. You walk through it slowly now, past arches etched with names half-legible, past fountains carved with Latin phrases and old French slogans, past doors that creak open with the gentlest nudge. This place, this imaginary city, it's not a metaphor anymore. It's a reminder that remembering is an act of rebellion, that writing things down is still one of the boldest things anyone can do, especially when the world insists your version of history is unimportant. Christine knew that. That's why she didn't just write books. She wrote continuity, and as the dusk settles over her city and the last line of her last poem fades from her memory into yours, you sit at one of those long stone benches with the others. You pick up a quill. dip it gently into ink. And you whisper, "I'm not starting. I'm continuing." You sit quietly in the shadow of her imagined city, listening. Not to her voice anymore, Christine is long gone, but to the aftershocks of it. The way the sound of her pen still hums through the pages, through time. You wonder how many other voices might have been lost if she hadn't written them into her books. How many might still be missing? But Christine knew that too. She didn't just preserve the voices she found. She warned us to look for the rest. You stroll through a different part of her legacy now. Less romantic, more brittle. Christine wasn't only a builder of allegorical cities. She was a documenter of royal lineage, a political commentator, a professional historian by medieval standards. And her tone could be sharp when she wanted. This was no dreamy mystic. She was a woman with ink-stained fingers and a ledger full of deadlines. That's what you see as she begins writing the life of Charles V, one of her most serious works. She doesn't take it lightly. Her father once served Charles V, the late king, and Christine feels both loyalty and caution. She knows the power of writing about royalty. She's seen how words can be twisted into weapons. And more than anything, she understands that memory is fragile. Without documentation, even kings vanish into rumor. So she builds again, not a city this time, but a legacy. She starts by describing Charles not as a warrior, but as a reader. That choice is deliberate. She frames him as wise, thoughtful, slow to speak, devoted to learning. It's not flattery, it's strategy. Christine's version of Charles V is the opposite of the violent, scheming aristocrats who surrounded his reign. She lifts him up not as an idol, but as a model. She writes about how he collected books, how he funded translations of Latin classics into French, how he encouraged learning at court, and how, unlike other rulers, he trusted knowledge more than gossip. That's her message to future kings. If you want to be remembered well, read more and swing swords less. Historians still debate how accurate Christine's portrait is. Was Charles really that enlightened? Or did Christine amplify his virtues to make a broader point about governance and legacy? Again, it doesn't matter as much as you think, because Christine isn't just writing about Charles. She's using him to teach. You picture her drafting passages late into the night, rubbing her temples, correcting her scribes, cross-referencing old records. This wasn't a quick poem dashed off in the heat of passion. This was work. Long, methodical, intellectual labor. She sends the completed manuscript to Louis of Orleans, nephew of Charles V and a prominent political figure. It's a gift, but also a mirror. Christine hopes Louis will see the contrast. Charles the Wise versus the current chaos of the Civil War. She doesn't say it directly, of course. Christine rarely does. She lets her metaphors and comparisons do the talking. But she's placing pressure on the present by invoking the past. And that's powerful, because most rulers want to believe they'll be remembered like their best ancestors. Christine uses that hope as leverage. You stand beside her in the quiet, watching her brush sand over the drying ink. She doesn't smile much these days. The court is a mess. France is still at war with itself. And the church's great schism still fractures religious authority. The world is full of shouting. Christine prefers precision, which is probably why her next move feels unexpected. She begins to write again. Not history, not poetry, but a manual, a guidebook for women, not noble women, not queens. All women, is short, direct, and shockingly modern. She offers practical advice. How to manage servants, how to settle disputes between children, how to avoid the trap of jealousy and gossip. She writes about choosing friends wisely, keeping books in the home, and staying vigilant for signs of dishonesty in business dealings. It's not the kind of book anyone expected from a poet of her stature. But that's the point. Christine believes in building from the ground up. If cities are to stand, their foundations must be solid. If women are to rise, they must first believe that their daily lives matter. Not just their dreams, but their chores, their conversations, their small decisions. You flip through the manuscript pages, marveling at how plain it is. No gilded initials, no illustrations, just words. Clean, calm, careful. She titles it the Book of the Three Virtues: reason, rectitude, and justice. reprising the symbolic guides from the City of Ladies. But now they speak less like mythic figures and more like wise ants. One part reads, "Be strong in silence, but never in ignorance." Another says, "Do not argue to be right, argue to be clear." And one of your favorites, "Books are the safest company in times of noise." Christine doesn't see this work as lesser than her grand allegories. In some ways, she sees it as more necessary. She wants women to live well, not just to be admired, but to thrive, to make decisions, to teach their children, to manage money and memory with equal care. She sends this book, too, into the world. And though it doesn't ripple like the City of Ladies, it finds quiet homes in convent libraries and noble households. Passed down, quoted in margins, tucked beside prayer books and calendars. And then Christine folds her hands and rests, not because she's done, but because she knows the next part isn't hers. You glance again at the women walking her imaginary city. They're different now, some in armor, some in veils, some in dresses that defy gravity. One reads from a screen, another paints on the side of a building. One just sits quietly, writing a letter no one else will ever read. And in each of them there is Christine. Not her words exactly, just her permission to speak, to write, to question, to not disappear. The days are long again. You stroll the perimeter of Christine's imagined city, where ivy winds gently up walls of ink and metaphor. Nothing crumbles here. No storm has blown it down. The structure stands, faintly humming with remembered lines and unfinished thoughts, because it was never made of stone. It was made of intention. And now, as the soft medieval dusk filters across the rooftops of this mental refuge, you sit at the edge of her legacy and watch what came next. Because history didn't wrap Christine's work in gold and place her neatly in the canon. No, history forgot her. It happened quietly. As the Renaissance dawned, scholars turned back to Greece and Rome. The revival of classical learning didn't include women like Christine, who wrote in the vernacular. Latin was the new currency of thought again, and Christine's elegant, precise French, so daring in her time, was now considered provincial. Her books disappeared from courts. Her name was trimmed from official records. And by the 16th century, even literate nobles would frown and ask, "Christine de who?" It's not surprising. After all, Christine's ideas didn't flatter the coming age. She believed in community. She believed in slow wisdom, in queens who ruled with subtlety, and scribes who left space for silence. She didn't celebrate conquest. She never claimed that masculinity was the price of greatness. And as the world lurched toward absolutism and empire, that made her inconvenient. You walk through an imaginary archive now, dimly lit. Rows of neglected shelves, leather bindings curling with age. A single candle flickers near a pile of books no one has opened in centuries. Christine's work sits there, not locked away, not banned, just unread. That's the cruelest kind of forgetting. And yet, something else was happening. In quiet corners of convents, some of her books survived. In the hands of female scribes and educated nuns, women who saw themselves in Christine's instructions, her voice whispered onward. They didn't quote her in royal proclamations. They didn't write manifestos. They just copied, carefully, faithfully. Christine's memory passed, not like fire, but like embers, until centuries later, someone noticed. It was the 19th century, long after Napoleon, long after the French Revolution, and a few curious scholars were digging through medieval manuscripts. One of them found a strange, vivid allegory, the City of Ladies, written by a woman, unheard of. And then another found her poem about Joan of Arc. Another her political writings. And slowly, Christine began to reappear. At first, she was treated as a novelty, a footnote in discussions of medieval literature. The first professional woman writer in France, they said, like a trivia answer. But others looked deeper. Feminist historians in the 20th century saw Christine not as a footnote, but a foundation. They noticed how she built arguments using classical logic, how she questioned misogynistic traditions without ever rejecting her faith, how she created not just commentary, but a framework for thinking differently. And then, finally, she was read again, not as a curiosity but as a colleague. Scholars debated her tone. Was she too careful? Too conciliatory? Too willing to concede moral high ground? Some argued she wasn't radical enough. Others admired her realism. But all agreed on this: she was first, and that mattered. Her work was translated again. Modern French, then English. University courses were built around her. YouTube lectures, articles, podcasts. Artists painted her. Activists quoted her. Suddenly, Christine de Pizan was no longer a ghost in the margins. She was a name again, and not just a name, a voice. You sit beneath the arches of her mental city, where new readers arrive every year. Students, thinkers, wanderers. They don't always understand the language, but they feel the structure. They feel how intentional it was, how Christine didn't just write about women. She wrote for them. She wanted them to see themselves reflected in something besides scorn or piety. She wanted their intellect recorded, their stories told, their names remembered. She wanted the future to have something to build on. And now here you are, in a world she could never have imagined, where women vote, write, teach, fly planes, run countries. And still, her questions remain sharp. Who tells your story? What tools are used to shape your memory? Whose voice is left behind in the footnotes? You return to her earliest works, those delicate poems written in grief after her husband died. They were never intended to change the world. They were raw, aching, unstructured. But even there, Christine was doing something rare, showing a woman thinking, not performing, not pleasing, just processing. And that's what grew into everything else: the debates, the allegories, the essays and treatises. It all started with a single sentence scratched into parchment by a woman who refused to remain quiet simply because she was expected to. And that's where the heart of her rebellion lives. Not in battle cries, not in fiery speeches, but in the steady, quiet refusal to disappear. As night falls over her city, you see lanterns being lit in new windows. Symbolic, maybe, but still comforting. One burns near a library where her books are shelved beside her male contemporaries. Finally, another flickers in the mind of a student writing their first paper on medieval feminism. Another in a poem scribbled on the back of a receipt by someone who just found the courage to share their voice. Christine's work didn't end with her death. It ends only when we stop reading. But tonight, you're still here, and so is she. You walk deeper into her city, where the streets begin to twist, less like a map, more like a memory. The buildings are older here, leaning toward each other like they're sharing secrets. Lanterns flicker in arched windows. The air smells faintly of parchment and pressed violets. Somewhere above, a clock tower ticks, not loudly, but insistently, like an echo from a library you haven't visited yet. You're in the heart of Christine's legacy now. Not the writing she did in the service of royalty, not the polished allegories or the reverent histories, but something subtler, stranger, the part of her work most people don't quote. The ideas she slipped between lines when no one was looking. Because Christine, even at her most careful, was always planting seeds. One of those seeds, women's education. It seems obvious now, perhaps too obvious to be radical. But in Christine's world, the very idea of a girl being taught to read was questioned. Schools for girls were rare and often limited to wealthy convents. Education was assumed to be wasted on women, at best a luxury, at worst dangerous. Christine didn't agree. She didn't just argue for education in her books. She performed it. She modeled a literate woman on every page, from her ability to quote classical authors to her debates with theologians. She wrote not as someone asking to learn, but as someone who already had, and who expected others to catch up. There's a passage in the Book of the City of Ladies that stops you in your tracks. She writes, "If it were customary to send little girls to school like boys, and if they were taught the same subjects, they would learn just as well." That sentence is a lightning strike in the 15th century, and Christine doesn't water it down. She doesn't follow it with a disclaimer. She doesn't say "within reason" or "unless it offends the church." She just states it, calmly, like a fact so self-evident it doesn't require defense. And in doing so, she offers something most revolutionary texts forget to include: a vision of normality. She makes the radical feel ordinary. You imagine a young girl, perhaps the daughter of a nobleman, or a well-placed merchant, reading those lines centuries ago, her finger underlining the words slowly, her eyes going wide, because Christine didn't say, "You should be allowed." She said, "Of course you can." That difference matters. It doesn't challenge power with a scream. It dissolves power with logic. You turn the corner and find a small schoolhouse tucked into a courtyard. Imaginary, of course, but you can hear the clink of inkpots, the murmur of voices reciting Latin verbs. And you realize something important. Christine wasn't just a writer. She was a curriculum. Her books were copied not only into noble libraries but also into the private collections of women who were tutoring daughters, nieces, pupils. You picture a quiet nun in Burgundy reading aloud from the treasure of the City of Ladies to a group of girls learning to stitch. You picture them pausing at a line, raising an eyebrow, whispering to each other. Did she really write that? Yes, she did, and she wrote it knowing it might be read in secret. Christine wasn't naive about the world she lived in. She knew the ink she spilled could stain her reputation. But she also knew that if her words made it to even one receptive mind, she'd planted something that couldn't be unplanted. And she was right. Historians still argue whether Christine saw education as a path to liberation or simply as a way to improve virtue. Some say she was too modest in her goals. Others believe she used modesty like armor, so that beneath her seemingly conservative advice, real change could take root. You can see both sides, because Christine often advised women to be quiet in public, to speak with care, to avoid confrontation. But then, sometimes in the same paragraph, she would write lines that burned through centuries of silence. To speak truth is not arrogance, but necessity. That's not submission. That's strategy. You climb a spiral staircase now to a part of the city less traveled. Here, you find her lesser-known letters and treatises, one to Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, another to the regents of France. You're struck by how direct she becomes in these writings. She no longer wraps her arguments in allegory. She speaks plainly even when addressing power. In one letter, she scolds the court for its wastefulness. In another, she pleads for an end to civil war, not out of sentiment but because the people suffer, because children starve, because culture withers when kings fight each other instead of protecting their lands. She reminds them, what is a court with no country left to rule? It's not just poetry anymore. Christine had become a political thinker, a civic voice, and yes, still a woman, but one who had outlived 3 kings, 5 wars, and 2 papal schisms. She had the long view, and she used it. But as you stand in this quiet tower with her final writings, you begin to feel the shadow creeping in. Not death, not yet, just a vanishing. Christine's last years are undocumented. No letters, no poems, no records of where she lived or died. She may have entered a convent, or she may have simply stopped writing. Maybe her hands ached, maybe her eyes dimmed, or maybe she felt, at last, that her part was finished, that she'd built enough. You imagine her one final evening, in a room lit by winter sun, flipping through her own pages like a mother reviewing a child's drawings. Not perfect, not permanent, but undeniably alive. She doesn't smile. Christine rarely does in your mind, but she nods, once, as if to say, they'll find this when they need it. And she was right, because here you are. You descend the spiral staircase slowly now, your hand grazing the smooth curve of the stone railing, worn by centuries of imagined footsteps. Below you, Christine's city stretches on, quiet but breathing. You feel it shift slightly under your feet, not with instability but with memory. Some cities crumble under the weight of time. Hers adapts, folds gently around each new reader. And tonight, that reader is you. But Christine would have never assumed you were a passive visitor. She didn't build this city as a museum. She built it as an invitation, a space not for veneration, but participation. Which is why, at this point in her story, you pause not to observe what she wrote, but to feel how she challenged you. Because Christine's work wasn't just about telling women they mattered. It was about asking them, what will you do with that truth? And nowhere is the question more sharp or more tender than in her writings on reputation. You find yourself standing before a long colonnade. The walls here are carved with names, etched into the stone by 1,000 quiet hands. Some names are familiar: Hecuba, Judith, Penelope. others unfamiliar. They shimmer faintly. Real women, half remembered by history. Some heroic, some tragic, all complicated. Christine argued that a woman's reputation was her fortress and also her prison. She warned of slander, of gossip, of how quickly the world turned on a woman who dared speak too much, write too freely, or grieve too visibly. And yet, she never told women to stay silent. She told them to choose their words carefully, because words, once spoken or written, could be weapons, but also shields, or blueprints. It's a strange duality. She offers you one foot in the medieval world's caution, one in something braver. You understand it now. Christine wasn't a radical in the way modern feminism understands the term, but she was subversive through caution. She taught that restraint could be a form of power and that a well-timed sentence could alter history more deeply than a scream. You lean against the column and read a line from the Treasure of the City of Ladies. Guard your speech as you would your soul, but never swallow injustice. It stays with you, because this is the pulse of Christine's rebellion. Not an uprising with banners and swords, but a quiet, unrelenting campaign to teach women how to endure and, more importantly, how to record that endurance. She saw how women were punished not just for what they did, but for how they were seen, for being too visible, too invisible, too proud, too quiet, too clever, too illiterate, too fluent. And yet she refused to let that paradox become paralysis. You remember a story she includes, one not often quoted, of a woman falsely accused of adultery by a jealous priest. Christine doesn't just defend her, she documents the legal absurdity of the accusation. She explains how slander functioned as a weapon of social control, especially against educated or wealthy women. She doesn't rant. She doesn't moralize. She analyzes. It's stunning, really, not because Christine is angry, though maybe she is, but because she believes that logic itself can be a form of defiance. She believes that writing carefully is sometimes more revolutionary than writing loudly. You walk on, now through gardens, wild, overgrown, tangled with metaphors. This part of her city feels personal. Less about politics, more about grief, because Christine wasn't just a chronicler of women's accomplishments. She was a witness to their suffering. You sit on a bench under a blooming archway and recall her early poems of mourning, the ones she wrote after her husband died. They don't feel like propaganda. They feel like the howl of someone trying very hard not to fall apart. She writes about loneliness, about financial terror, about trying to hold a family together with almost nothing. She writes, "My tears carve valleys in my face where youth once lingered." It's the kind of line that doesn't ask for sympathy. It simply exists, and in doing so, gives permission to every woman after her to not hide pain. Christine understood that pain and power could coexist. That sorrow wasn't weakness. That grief was often the birthplace of ideas. You think of how often we're told to be one thing at a time, brave or broken, bold or grieving. But Christine didn't live that way. Her life was a constant, braided tension, widow and worker, mother and scholar, mourner and mentor. She refused to flatten herself. And that refusal? That's the blueprint she left for you. You rise from the bench and notice the garden opens onto a long hallway. The ceiling here is high, arching like the nave of a cathedral. But instead of saints, the niches hold images of forgotten scholars, women who translated, copied, annotated, preserved. Christine never claimed she was alone. She said, "I am but one link in a chain." And here you feel that chain stretch behind and before you. You walk the hallway slowly, brushing your fingertips along the wall. Each plaque bears a name you've never heard. A woman who once taught philosophy in Seville. A scribe who added footnotes to her monastery's only surviving copy of Boethius. A teenager in 1483 who, under candlelight, copied Christine's poem about Joan of Arc by hand into the back of her schoolbook. It gives you chills, because that's the true city, not the buildings, not the metaphor, but the lineage, the idea that women, even silenced, even censored, kept building, kept preserving, kept passing knowledge in margins, in whispers, in lullabies and recipes and long letters never mailed. And Christine? She was the one who wrote that reality down before anyone else thought to. She said, "Do not believe the lies told about her sex. I have seen otherwise, and I write it here." You reach the end of the hallway. There's a door just slightly ajar. No sign, no title, just waiting. You step through. The door doesn't creak, it exhales. You slip through quietly, like you've been expected. The light in here is different, warmer, softer, like a room lit by sunrise before anyone's drawn back the curtains. There's no furniture, just walls lined with open books, pages fluttering gently in a breeze you can't feel. And in the center, nothing, just space. This is the room Christine never got to write, not because she lacked the time or the words, but because the world around her collapsed before she could finish. War returned. Paris was in chaos. And then, a girl from Domremy picked up a sword, Joan of Arc. You know her story, or at least the cartoon of it. The peasant girl who heard divine voices, who rode into battle in shining armor, who led French troops to improbable victories before being captured, tried, and burned. But Christine saw something else. She saw confirmation. See, by the early 1420s, Christine was old, worn thin by years of famine, war, and grief. Her patrons were scattered or dead. Her city was unraveling. The France she had praised in the book of the deeds of Charles V was dissolving into civil war and foreign occupation. For all her efforts to teach moderation, to champion wisdom, to offer structure, everything seemed to be failing. And then came Joan, a girl, untrained, unlettered, unconnected, who somehow turned the tide of a war, who somehow inspired men to follow her into fire, who defied every law of hierarchy, theology, and social expectation. Historians still argue whether Christine truly believed Joan's visions were divine. Some say she was swept up in nationalistic fervor. Others claim she simply admired Joan's courage. But in truth, Christine doesn't analyze Joan. She celebrates her. She writes a poem, a strange, fierce, luminous little work titled The Tale of Joan of Arc. It's one of the last things Christine ever wrote. And it reads like a woman astonished by the thing she always hoped could be true, that a woman could lead, could win, could become history, not just comment on it. You sit with those lines for a moment. They shimmer more than they sing. There's a fever to them, like Christine is rushing, maybe sensing that she won't get another chance. She calls Joan a marvel that silences doubt. She calls her the shining sword of France. And most tellingly, she writes, I once wrote of ladies wise and good, but never of one who bore the banner through mud. It's the closest Christine ever comes to saying, I was wrong. I didn't dream big enough. That's what makes this poem so powerful. Not just its subject, but what it does to the woman who wrote it. Christine, for the first time, becomes the student, the astonished observer, the witness rather than the builder. And that humility, that quiet astonishment, it breaks your heart a little, because she must have known that Joan would not live, that girls who defy power never die quietly. And still, Christine immortalized her, not as a martyr, but as a miracle. You imagine her writing it by lamplight, hands unsteady, hearing the sounds of war again outside her windows, the city falling, the world shrinking, and yet here she is, inking defiance onto the page one last time. It's no coincidence this is her last work, because Christine's journey wasn't about creating a perfect argument. It was about building possibility. And in Joan, she saw the most impossible thing of all. A woman who did not ask for power. She took it. That shook Christine's foundations in the best way. You rise from the silent room and push open another door. This one leads into light. The architecture dissolves into sky. And suddenly you realize Christine's city was never enclosed. It never ended at the walls. It was meant to fade into the world, to blend with your streets, your schools, your stories. You were never just visiting it. You've been living in it all along. Every time you spoke, taught, wrote, or remembered, you glance back only once. The poem to Joan is still there, glowing slightly on its pedestal of parchment. But Christine is gone. Not lost, just dispersed. Into books, into brains, into breath. That was always her plan. She never wanted to be worshipped. She wanted to be useful, and she was. You walk forward now, and the city fades behind you. Not because it's gone, but because it's with you. In your spine, in your steps, in the quiet little voice that says, build. Even when no one's looking, you hear her again, faintly, as if from another room in time. I wrote so you would not forget us, and you haven't. Not tonight. You step out into twilight, not metaphorical this time. Just the deepening hush of a sky dimming gently into blue. Christine's city has faded behind you, but her voice still follows. Not as a whisper, not anymore, but as a rhythm beneath your thoughts. Like footsteps walking beside yours, you realize, finally, that she was never just writing about women. She was writing about memory, about who gets remembered and how and why, about the quiet mechanics behind legacy, the scribes who chose which stories to preserve, the libraries that burned inconvenient truths, the kings who erased names with a single decree. Christine de Pizan saw all that, and she said, essentially, no. She chose to become inconvenient, and now, with the city behind you and the rest of her world ahead, you find yourself thinking not just of her life, but of her intentions. She wasn't trying to be a saint or a rebel. She wasn't seeking vengeance or fame. She wasn't even trying to prove women were better. She just wanted it known that they were there, that they thought, that they wrote, that they shaped governments, raised empires, and translated Aristotle when no one else bothered. She wanted to record them before they disappeared. You pass into a quieter part of her world now. Not the city, not the books, but the impact she couldn't have imagined. The ripple she created by simply surviving and writing about it. You begin to see the shadows of women across centuries who carried her torch without knowing her name. A girl in an abbey in 1523, secretly copying Christine's treatise on virtue into the margin of a psalter. A teacher in 1841 slipping the City of Ladies into her lessons despite her headmaster's disapproval. A suffragette in 1909 who quotes Christine in a pamphlet, citing a medieval woman who once said women are no less rational, only less taught. Christine was never famous in her own right. She was useful, and that usefulness, that sharp, well-cut tool of intellect and ink, kept resurfacing, like driftwood from a sunken ship, carried across oceans of forgetting. It would take until the 20th century for her name to be spoken aloud in classrooms, for scholars to recognize her as not only a poet, but a political theorist, a moral philosopher, an early feminist not by label but by function, a woman who used the structures of medieval society not to burn it down, but to redefine who it was built for. That's harder than it sounds. Anyone can shout from the margins. Christine stood inside the gates and said, "I belong here too." You recall one of her poems, not a famous one, but one buried in the middle of a larger manuscript, rarely quoted. It reads, "May my ink be plain and my words be heard, not gilded, not grand, but stubborn as stone." That was her style. Unfancy, unshakable, and that's why she endured, because she knew the world didn't need another sermon, or another saint, or another sword. It needed structure, a place to hold women's memories, contradictions, brilliance, errors, joy. Christine didn't paint women as flawless. She didn't reduce them to victims. She let them be messy. She let them disagree, argue, fail. But she gave them names, gave them dignity, gave them room. You stop walking now. You're standing at the edge of a river. The same river Christine walked beside in Paris. The same Seine that carried news, carried soldiers, carried plague. You imagine her pacing its banks, wrapped in a dark cloak, muttering lines to herself, drafting arguments, rewriting stanzas. Paris was crumbling around her. But she kept writing, because she believed history wasn't shaped by kings alone. It was shaped by scribes, by people who took the time to write things down, even if no one was listening yet. And now you're here, listening. Christine would smile at that. Not broadly, just a small, knowing lift at the corner of her mouth. The smile of someone who expected to be forgotten, but who wrote like she'd be remembered anyway, because that's what faith looks like. Not belief in God, not belief in justice, but belief in words. In the quiet, durable act of putting truth to paper and trusting that someone, somewhere, some century later, would read it and understand. That's what you're doing now. You're not just reading Christine, you're completing her sentence. And in doing so, becoming part of her city. You turn from the river and find a quiet bench, half real, half imagined, just beneath a linden tree. Its leaves shift softly, almost musically, brushing one another in time with your breath. You sit and exhale. The sky is darker now, and the light seems to come from within the story itself. From the pages, the footnotes, the fragments of thought that Christine left behind for you to find. And this is where her greatest quiet rebellion lives. Not in any one book, but in the fact that she kept writing, long after she had any reason to believe it would matter. She didn't have patrons throwing coin at her anymore. The French court was breaking apart. The church was fractured. The 100 Years' War was devouring both countryside and capital. And still, she rose each morning, adjusted her inkstone, and put quill to parchment. Why? Because somewhere deep in the marrow of her being, Christine de Pizan believed that survival was not enough. She wanted meaning, and she wanted other people's survival, especially women's, to be remembered with dignity. So she recorded what others discarded. She named names that history had tossed aside. She wrote biographies of ancient queens, wives, inventors, warriors, and philosophers. Not because they were flawless, but because they existed. Because they did things and no one else was bothering to say so. You remember a small detail from one of her later texts, her description of a female philosopher from ancient Alexandria, Hypatia. She notes almost casually that Hypatia was murdered by a mob. And then Christine writes, she taught with clarity and died with dignity, though her enemies did neither. Such a simple sentence. And yet it cuts like a blade, because Christine understood violence. She had seen it, lived it, suffered under it. But she never glorified it. She never made martyrs her centerpiece. Instead, she uplifted wisdom, strategy, and endurance. She wanted women not just to survive injustice, but to outlive it with their minds intact. And that's what makes her so unusual for her time. For any time, Christine didn't want women to become men. She wanted them to become fully themselves, without apology, without erasure, and without pretending to be anything they weren't. She believed that thinking, learning, writing, and teaching weren't male activities. They were human. You hear footsteps on the cobbled path behind you. Not threatening. Just symbolic. Maybe a reminder that the city she built, her metaphorical one, is always being walked by new minds. New readers. New thinkers. And you wonder now, how many parts of your own life are shaped by the echoes of Christine's work? The textbook you once opened in a literature class that had a chapter on women writers. The quiet way your favorite professor spoke about narrative authority. The article you stumbled across on medieval proto-feminism that led you to this script. Each of those moments was a thread. A line in her tapestry. Christine never called herself a feminist. That word hadn't been invented yet. But she acted as one. More precisely, she acted like a person who believed women were whole humans, capable of complexity, deserving of representation. That's all it ever had to mean. And yet, it still wasn't safe to say aloud in her time. So she cloaked it in reason, in allegory, in scholarship, and still, it survived. You stand again. The city is fading once more, its outlines softening, its streets dimming. But not because you're leaving. It's because you've absorbed it. Christine's work was always designed to vanish into the bloodstream of your thought. To dissolve into your vocabulary, your habits, your internal definitions of fairness, worth, intellect. She wanted you to read her not so you'd remember her, but so you'd remember yourself in every voice that had been forgotten. You find yourself now walking through a library, not hers, not anyone's, just a collage of memory. Stacks of books. Marginalia. Scribes with tired eyes and aching wrists. Digital copies blinking to life on classroom projectors. Teenage girls highlighting her words without even knowing the context. Scholars comparing versions of her manuscripts side by side in echoing archives. And in all of it, Christine, not omnipresent, but constant, like a hum, a line beneath the melody that gives the whole thing shape. She'd be amused, maybe. Wry. A little flattered. Possibly annoyed at how many of her best lines were misattributed or misquoted. But she wouldn't complain. She'd nod. She'd say, good. You noticed. Now what will you write down so others don't vanish? You reach out and touch the spine of one book, a simple volume of her collected writings, translated into modern English. Inside is a single handwritten inscription by a reader from the 1990s. She made me feel like I wasn't the first to feel this way. That's it. That's the heart of it. Christine de Pizan didn't offer answers. She offered company. And in a world that so often insists on solitary struggle, that alone is a kind of revolution. You wander now through silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind that falls when a library closes. That soft, breath-holding stillness between thought and echo. There's no rush, no looming climax, just the slow settling of memory. You're still inside Christine's story, but it no longer clings to specific dates or pages. It breathes. This is the part of history no one outlines. The after history, the residue of influence. And Christine? She left a lot of residue. You find yourself in a gallery now, long, hushed, gently lit. No paintings. Just phrases etched along the walls like constellations. Lines from her work, some in French, others translated, some barely legible from age. You trail your fingers across the words. A woman may be learned, though men forget it. A city may fall, but the pen remains standing. To speak one's truth quietly is not to whisper. She wasn't trying to be poetic. She just wrote the way she thought, precisely, patiently, with an undertow of quiet defiance. You sit in the center of the gallery. Around you are invisible debates, some ancient, some still alive. Was Christine truly the first professional woman writer in Europe? That term, professional, still causes disagreements. Did she get paid consistently? Did she rely on patronage or operate independently? Historians still argue. Some say she wrote simply to survive. Others say her work became self-sustaining, that by the end of her career, she was more than solvent. She was respected. But respect in a world shaped by men was always conditional, fragile, a breath away from dismissal, and still she persisted. In her time, Christine was considered a marvel, a curiosity. The idea that a woman could debate clerics, advise queens, critique military strategies without scandal was almost too much for the chroniclers to accept. So many didn't. They called her the widow de Pizan, as if her widowhood explained her talents. But Christine was never just a widow. She was a witness to a city, to a war, to a changing France, and to the untold lives of women before her. She made herself a mirror and held it up to the past, asking, "Do you see them yet?" You glance up. Projected above you is the faintest image, Christine's signature. The original, drawn in her own steady, looping hand. It's not ornate, just clear. And beside it, faintly scrawled in red ink, the initials of a scribe who copied her work in 1431. We don't know that scribe's name. We rarely do, but Christine would have remembered her. You walk to the end of the gallery where a narrow staircase spirals down. It feels like descending into time. Not backward, but inward. You're not moving toward an ending. You're folding deeper into the story. At the bottom of the staircase, a room, round, dimly lit, filled with chairs. But not grand. More like a reading circle in a quiet school. In each chair, an imagined reader, different centuries, different clothing, different languages. A nun with ink-stained fingers. A French schoolgirl in a 1902 uniform. A woman in a trench coat, her shoes muddy from a protest in 1970s Paris. They're all reading Christine. Not reverently. Not ritualistically. Just engaged. You listen. The words pass between them in whispers. Debates. Laughter. Corrections. Admiration. This was Christine's real vision. Not a city with walls, but a conversation that never stops. A chorus of voices saying, "We were here. We thought. We mattered." She would have loved this room. Not because she's at its center, but because she isn't. Because her work became catalyst, not command. You take a chair beside them. There's no ceremony, no expectation. Just a book, her book, resting gently in your lap. You open it to a random page and read a line you've never noticed before. Let us build with what they left us and with what we carry still. It's not a call to arms. It's a reminder that Christine didn't live in a vacuum. She inherited fragments of history, some crumbling, some contradictory, and pieced them together with care. Not to rewrite history, but to complete it, to say, "You missed a few names. Let me help." You look around the room again and wonder, what pieces are you carrying? What names live in your family, your ancestry, your culture, waiting to be remembered properly? Christine would ask you that. Not gently, not cruelly, just expectantly. Because remembering isn't passive, it's work. And for Christine, it was sacred. Even when it exhausted her. Even when it made her enemies. Even when the world stopped rewarding her for it. She kept going. You close the book. The room fades. The gallery fades. The whole imagined city breathes once more and rests. You've walked its streets. Sat in its gardens. Climbed its towers. Listened in its halls. Now you carry it with you. And Christine? She never asks for your loyalty. Just your witness. The city does not vanish. It rests. It waits. And you, no longer just a visitor, rise from your chair, not as someone leaving, but as someone joining. Because Christine de Pizan didn't build this world for you to admire. She built it so you could carry a piece of it back with you. Out of parchment. Into reality. You step once more into the cool medieval twilight. The sky overhead is violet now, dotted with the earliest stars. The bells in the city's distant tower ring, but not with urgency. Just the slow, even chime of hours passing, as they always have. Christine wrote about time often. Not as something oppressive, but as something worth marking. Holding. Defining on your own terms. You start to notice how she marked time differently than others in her era. While kings counted battles and popes counted conversions, Christine counted consequences. Not victories, but effects. She wrote about what happened after the parades. About the widows, the orphans, the displaced scholars, The women pushed out of courtly circles to make room for newer, shinier ornaments. She knew that what followed mattered more than what led, so she wrote for what came after, including you. And now, here, as you walk the edges of her metaphorical city, that becomes clear. She wasn't just writing from the 15th century. She was writing toward the future, toward the reader who would one day wonder, were there women who thought deeply back then? And her answer is a calm, deliberate yes. There were. I am one. You pass a stone bench beneath a flowering tree. Someone's left a book there, open, half-read, the wind ruffling its pages like a nervous gesture. You glance down. It's the treasure of the City of Ladies again. A different edition, a different generation of translator, but the same voice within. Christine is addressing a young noblewoman, advising her to gather knowledge as a gardener gathers herbs, not all at once, but carefully, and with respect to the seasons. You smile. To such an elegant image. It softens the idea of learning, makes it feel like something alive, rooted, curated. Christine didn't believe in force-feeding truth. She believed in cultivating it, and she believed truth changed shape as it was passed down. What made sense to her in 1405 would not land the same way in 2025. But that didn't mean it stopped being useful. It just meant it had to be tended. That's why she never wrote absolutes. She asked more questions than she answered. And she loved the phrase, let us consider, let us, not let me. Christine wasn't interested in sermons. She wanted dialogue, reflection, and if you disagreed, that was fine. She'd still offer her thoughts. Not because she thought she was right, but because she thought it was worth talking about. She once wrote, to refuse a woman's voice is to refuse half the world's truth. And it's true. You imagine a world where Christine hadn't written. A world where no one preserved her pages. Where girls were still told no woman had ever led, ever built, ever resisted. Where scholars still insisted medieval women had no thoughts worth recording. That timeline is real. It almost happened, and the only reason it didn't, someone kept her pages safe. A bored scribe. A rebellious nun. A curious historian. A tired translator in 1924 who saw something in her phrasing that felt oddly modern. Each of them passed the torch one dusty page at a time. Christine believed that was enough. You look back down the street, no longer metaphorical. Just a cobbled lane lit by soft lanterns. There's a girl walking ahead of you now. She's young. Jeans, sneakers, earbuds. Completely modern. But in her backpack is a printed copy of the Book of the City of Ladies. Marked with highlighter. Margins filled with messy notes. She doesn't know you're behind her. Doesn't know she's walking through a city someone imagined for her centuries ago. But she's here. And she's reading. That's the rebellion. Christine's work wasn't meant to stir armies. It was meant to outlast forgetting. She never raised a flag. Never led a march. But she sat at a desk over and recorded what no one else cared to. She wrote about grief and power and compromise and motherhood and war and philosophy, and she did it not because it was safe or easy or fashionable, but because it was true. And truth, to her, was always worth recording. Even if no one thanked her. Even if no one listened for 500 years. You pause beneath another archway. A quote is carved overhead, one of her more obscure ones. It reads, "Let the ink spill not for vanity, but for remembrance." Such a gentle idea. That writing is not about being known, but about noticing. About creating space for others to step forward. To say, you too are part of this. And that's exactly what she's done for you. This isn't her monument. It's your invitation to remember, to speak, to wonder, to record, not for glory, just so that one day someone else might whisper, "I thought I was alone in thinking this," and realize they never were. You've stopped looking for the edges of her city now. There aren't any. It's the kind of place that spreads with you, reshaping itself to fit your steps. Streets unfurl into questions. Rooms rearrange when you blink. Every wall you lean on gives way to a passage you didn't know you needed. You understand now, Christine never built a fortress. She built a library without walls. One that whispers, stay as long as you like. Take whatever you need. And leave something behind when you go. You're deeper into that library now. Not the grand echoing halls of kings and saints, but the workrooms. The corners. The places where women worked in silence for generations, copying manuscripts with frozen fingers, stitching margin notes between candle drips, carrying memory like contraband through history's customs gate. This is where Christine's real magic happened. She wrote in the margins. Of power, of permission, of expectation. And because she lived there on the edge of acceptability, not quite outlawed, not quite endorsed, she learned how to make even the faintest ink speak loudly. She knew where to slip the dangerous sentences. She knew how to make her writing survive the eyes of men who might try to erase it. She'd couch her critiques in allegory, her fury in poetry, her politics in flattery. And yet, somehow, her meaning always got through. Take, for example, her argument against the popular medieval belief that women were inherently less rational than men. She never screamed about it. She didn't write a manifesto. She wrote a fable, a conversation between Lady Reason and a skeptical narrator, Christine herself, half in character, half in code. And Lady Reason calmly dismantles the idea, point by point, citing female philosophers, poets, inventors, queens, and warriors. It's so calm, it's subversive. Christine uses the very format men trusted: dialogue, allegory, moral example, and turns it inside out. She keeps the structure. She just changes who gets to speak. And in doing so, she reclaims the narrative form. You walk into a side room. It's filled with letters, stacked in glass cases, bundled with twine. Some are imaginary, conjured from Christine's own pages, written to queens, courtiers, fellow scholars. Others are real. Modern responses, digital essays, emails, hand-scrawled notes left in the margins of library copies. Christine has readers still. Some write dissertations. Some write fan fiction. Some simply underline. One note written in pencil in a 1981 edition of City of Ladies reads, "Why have I never heard of her until now? Why was she hidden?" You can imagine Christine reading that, nodding slowly, and replying not with anger but with bone-deep weariness. Because they only remember what they fear. And they didn't fear me loudly enough. It's devastating. And also accurate. Christine was dangerous in the wrong way. Too clever to be dismissed, too careful to be condemned. She was not dramatic. Not messy, not tragic. She did not explode. She endured. And endurance, as it turns out, is harder to erase. You continue deeper into the room where the air thickens with ink and the scent of old paper. It's not dusty. It's warm. Lived in. This is the heart of Christine's world, the part built not from narrative, but from resistance through repetition. Because that's what she did. Over and over. Wrote, explained, reframed, until her words became unavoidable. And even if no one crowned her a philosopher or saint or founding mother, her ideas slipped under the door anyway. You stop at one final desk. It's not hers. It's yours. A blank page rests atop it. A single line of text waits at the top. You are here because someone wrote you in. That's what Christine did. She wrote you in, even if she didn't know your name. Even if she couldn't imagine the time you live in, the technology you hold, the complexities you navigate. She believed you existed, and she wanted you to have a place in the story. That was her rebellion, not just naming herself, but naming you before you could, not as a prophecy, but as a possibility. You sit. The blank page stares back. The pen is waiting, not as a symbol, but as a tool. Christine didn't write to be admired. She wrote to make space. So here you are. What will you do with that? Because now you understand. This story doesn't end with Christine's death, or even with her last poem. Continues every time someone rereads her, reimagines her, rebuilds the city word by word, in the voice of their own time. Christine doesn't get the final word. She hands it to you. You linger at the desk. The blank page still glows faintly under your fingertips, but you're not quite ready to write. Not yet. Because Christine's voice hasn't faded, it's simply softened. Receded into your thoughts like mist curling around a riverbank. And in the stillness, something deeper comes into focus, the strange loneliness that comes with being first. Christine de Pizan was the first of many things. The first woman in Europe known to earn a living by writing. The first to mount a serious, intellectual defense of women in prose. The first to build a literary city to house those forgotten by history. But being first isn't just brave, it's isolating. No one cleared a path for her. No one gave her permission. She stood in a room full of men where every chair had a nameplate, and she carved herself a seat from what no one offered her. And then she started taking attendance. She said, "Where are the women? Why haven't you listed them?" And when no one answered, she started naming them herself. You close your eyes and see her, not the myth, not the icon, but the woman. Mid-30s, ink on her sleeves, fingers aching from winter drafts and late-night copying. Paris shaking from unrest outside her walls. Her son asleep in the corner. Her debts piling. Her patronage slipping. And still, she sharpens her quill and returns to the page. Because something in her refused to believe silence was noble. Or necessary. Or safe. Christine understood early that when women don't tell their stories, someone else will, and the someone else will get it wrong. And so she wrote, not out of arrogance, out of urgency. You think of one of her most famous passages, buried halfway through the book of the City of Ladies, when she describes the moment of realization. I saw that the world was wrong, and that I had been wrong too in believing it. So I turned to Lady Reason, and she opened a door. She's talking about allegory, of course, Lady Reason being the personification of logic who guides Christine through the construction of her city. But you understand the subtext now. The door that opened wasn't imaginary. It was herself. Christine, the widow, the mother, the quiet court writer. She stepped through that door into something radical, her own voice, her own authority, and she never walked back. That's why her work still stirs something, even now. It's not just because she defended women, it's how she did it. Not with declarations, but with evidence. Not with slogans, but with lineage. She showed you that women had always been there. That their erasure was not proof of absence, but proof of someone else's fear. That's the through line. Not rage, not vengeance, but clarity. Christine never lost her temper on the page. She kept her sentences clean, her examples sharp, her tone rational. And because of that, she reached places where louder voices couldn't. She wrote to be read by those who didn't believe her yet. And somehow she reached you, even across 600 years. You rise from the desk and walk back into the open air of her imagined city, which no longer feels imagined. It's less like a place and more like a frequency now. You tune into it every time you read with intention. Every time you notice whose stories are missing. Every time you ask, why this version? Why not another? Christine tuned you to that frequency. She made you question authorship, authority, and absence. And she did it all while living through plague, war, displacement, and loss. You paused by a low fountain, water glistening under starlight. On its rim, a carved sentence, to write is not to win. It is to remain. You smile. It's one of Christine's lines, rarely quoted. But it hits hard, because that's the point, isn't it? She didn't write to convince kings. She didn't write to rewrite theology. She wrote to remain. To place something of herself into the current of time so that, when the floodwaters rose, her voice would still be floating somewhere, waiting to be read. And that voice, clear, calm, methodical, reminds you that survival is an act of composition. One thought at a time, you begin walking again, not because the city is done with you, but because you're ready to carry part of it with you. And as you walk, the buildings blur, not from fading, but from integration. They fold into your mind, into your bookshelf, into the next article you read, the next time you pause and ask, what's missing here? Who's missing? You know now, if Christine taught you anything, it's that forgetting is not passive. It is curated. And memory? Memory is a decision, one you make every time you choose what to read, to share, to remember, to question. And every time you choose not to look away from voices that weren't supposed to last. Like hers, like yours. You reach the edge of the city, but the path doesn't end. It becomes less literal, less paved, more like a suggestion than a destination. A thin ribbon of possibility stretching forward into terrain that's not mapped yet. Christine would have liked that. She always did prefer a question to a conclusion. You glance behind you once, half expecting the buildings to dissolve now that you've walked through them. But they don't. They remain sturdy and dreamlike because Christine built them out of more than ink and metaphor. She built them out of memory sustained by action. And now, as you begin down this newer, fainter path, the question becomes, what do you do with what she gave you? Because here's the thing Christine understood better than most. History isn't what happened. History is what got written down, what got repeated, what got protected from decay and indifference. And she didn't just want women included in that process. She wanted them to own it. She wanted you to pick up a pen and not ask permission. To write in your own margins. To rebuild your own towers. To correct what others have flattened. That's what makes her work radical even now. Not that she existed, but that she planned for you to follow her. You begin to see it more clearly, the way her work was never meant to be static. It wasn't a monument. It was a blueprint. A kind of spiritual scaffolding for future thought. Christine built her city knowing it would be expanded, argued with, renovated, because she believed deeply in dialogue. Even the structure of the City of Ladies invites it. It's built like a conversation between Christine and three allegorical women, reason, rectitude, and justice. They explain, they question, they gently push back. And Christine listens, adapts, reflects. She doesn't present herself as infallible. She presents herself as in process. That's why she still resonates. She's not holding a microphone. She's passing it. You walk a little farther, and the ground beneath your feet becomes soft. Less street, more earth. The path is growing greener now. Less city, more field. You're returning not to a place but to yourself. Christine would insist on that. Her whole project was never about escape. It was about re-entry, back into the world, but wiser, sharper, tuned to notice who isn't being mentioned and why, and to speak up not with rage or spectacle but with something far more difficult, precision. Christine's great power was not volume. It was focus. She made her points carefully, thoughtfully, unshakably. And because of that, she couldn't be dismissed as just emotional or uninformed, two of patriarchy's favorite excuses. She studied. She researched. She quoted. And then she said, "Now that I have read your version of the truth, allow me to offer mine." It's a move you can make too. You've probably made it already without even realizing. Every time you notice a textbook leaves someone out, every time you hear a historical anecdote and ask, whose voice is missing here? That instinct, that noticing, that's Christine in you. Not because she taught you everything, but because she reminded you to ask better questions. You pause again, this time beside a tree. Its bark is carved with dozens of names. Not the famous ones, but the quieter ones. Abbesses, healers, letter writers, midwives, textile scholars, astronomers, scribes. Many you've never heard of. You suspect Christine had. She spent her whole life recovering these names, pulling them from myths, records, oral traditions, manuscripts that were fraying at the edges. She didn't make them heroic. She made them visible, and in doing so, she made visibility a virtue. You reach out and touch the bark. It's warm. A single word glows beneath your fingertips, not a name, just a message. Still here? That's what Christine was really writing all along. We are still here, even if no one builds statues for us. Even if our work is misfiled or misattributed. Even if our ideas are adopted and never credited. We are still here, thinking, creating, remembering, resisting forgetfulness in whatever way we can. Christine never asked you to worship her. She asked you to join her, and that invitation still stands. As the sun starts to rise on the far side of her city, your city, you feel it. The shift, the hinge, the way a story closes without ending. She brought you here, and now she's letting you go, not away, just forward, because her work is done. And yours is just beginning. The city doesn't vanish behind you. It follows in your breath, your thoughts, your fingertips as they twitch slightly, unconsciously, as if echoing a quill's motion on parchment. You're not carrying Christine's story anymore, you're inhabiting it. And in that inhabitation, a subtle change takes place. You stop asking, who was Christine de Pizan? You begin asking, what does it mean to think like her? Because that's her real legacy, not just her books, not just her arguments, but her mode of seeing. Her refusal to accept that the visible world was the complete one. Her sense that behind every canon, every myth, every official record, something essential had been cut away, and someone had to go in after it. You step into a wide, open courtyard now. There are no more books here, no more allegorical conversations or stained glass metaphors. Just a long wooden table, clean, waiting. At one end, a worn inkpot. At the other, a single chair. It's not Christine's. It's yours. There's something almost eerie about how ordinary it feels. No gilded walls. No ancient inscriptions. Just space. The kind of space Christine carved out of a time that didn't want her voice. And here it is again, passed on like a quiet inheritance. This is her final gift to you, the conditions to begin. And you realize she wasn't writing for her time. Not really. Her world was brittle. At war. Unstable. Her work was never going to fix the 15th century. But she wrote anyway, because she was writing for the centuries that came after. She was writing for the long game, for minds like yours. And the fact that you're here now, listening, thinking, following, means she was right. She didn't need to save her world. She only needed to interrupt its forgetting, which she did. Page by page. Now, seated at that long table, you begin to understand just how radical that interruption was. Christine didn't just write counter-arguments. She wrote counter-legacies. She dared to imagine a history that did not treat women's silence as natural, but as coerced. And once you understand that, you see everything differently. You begin to spot the gaps, the blank spaces where women's stories should have been. The centuries where their names are absent not because they did nothing, but because they were not written down. You see how often modern voices still echo Christine's dilemma. How even today, when women speak, they're asked to prove what Christine had to prove. That they are credible, that they are rational, that they belong in the discourse at all. The details change. The structure does not. Christine saw it early, and she refused to comply. Not by shouting, but by writing better. She didn't just out-argue her critics. She outwrote them, and as you sit at her metaphorical desk, you feel the shape of that possibility settle into your bones. You don't have to become her. You don't have to match her intellect or her patience or her tone. You only have to remember this, that when she had no precedent, she became one. Not to be admired, but to be used. You hear the faintest breeze now, though it might be the whisper of a turning page, and you look up. The sky above the courtyard is silvering. Not quite morning. Not quite memory. Time becomes a soft loop. You think of how many lives she touched that she never knew. How many readers carried her phrases like seeds in the linings of their coats, dropping them into conversations and essays and imaginations across centuries. One of them is you, and now the responsibility, gentle but firm, presses itself into your hands. You're not just reading history anymore, you're participating in it. Because remembering is not passive, it's a skill. And like Christine, you now have to choose what gets remembered next. You rise slowly. The inkpot gleams, and behind you, just for a moment, you imagine Christine there. Watching. Not smiling. Not judging. Just observing like she always did. Sharp-eyed. Alert. Ready to listen if you speak. But she doesn't say anything. She's done speaking. This is your page now. You don't write right away. You sit. You breathe. You listen. Because Christine de Pizan didn't teach you to rush. She taught you to notice. To observe how history moves not in sudden declarations but in careful repetitions. In what's copied, what's footnoted, what's passed down, and what isn't. So before you write, you do what she did. You look around, at the table, at the empty space beside you, at the chair across from yours, the one you realize was never meant to stay empty. Christine always assumed someone else would come, that someone else must come, not just to read her work, but to add to it, to revise it, to challenge it even, because what she built was never supposed to be a closed system. It was a living one. A city is only a city if someone lives in it. And Christine's city was always meant for company, not worship, not study, but inhabiting. You walk again through this quiet place of mind, this somewhere between dream and memory space, and find yourself in a garden. The same one from before, though the flowers have changed. Time moves oddly here. Petals bloom with thoughts. Vines stretch toward forgotten ideas. Somewhere, a book opens itself to a page you didn't know you needed. It's Christine's book of the 3 virtues, a companion to her more famous city of ladies. And this one isn't for defense. It's for advice, a guide for women of all stations. Queens, midwives, merchants, mothers, widows. She tells them how to navigate their world. Not with blind obedience, but with cleverness, with subtle power. She tells them when to speak and when to wait. How to keep their dignity, how to read the men around them, how to survive. It's practical, grounded, almost shockingly modern. And then she says something small, something you almost miss. The world does not see your labor. That does not make it less. You stop walking, because there it is, the quiet heartbeat of her entire project. Christine wrote because she saw what the world refused to see. The invisible work, the intellectual labor of mothers, the diplomacy of sisters, the documentation of nuns, the observations of healers, the philosophies of women whose names never made it past the monastery gate. She saw it, and once she saw it, she couldn't look away. Neither can you now. You start noticing it in your own life, don't you? In the stories your grandmother told that no one ever recorded. In the way your mother explained history gently, sideways, in parables. In the way your sister marks her books, not for school, but for survival. In the way a stranger online tells the truth of her life, and you believe her, even if no scholar has written it down. These are Christine's descendants. They don't wear crowns. They don't need to. They wield something heavier. Memory. You walk past a statue now, not of Christine, of someone she once wrote about. A female scholar from Carthage. Long lost to history, barely more than a name in a Roman text. Christine resurrected her in one of her books, dedicating 2 pages to her work and a footnote to her defiance. That was her rebellion. Not just naming herself, but naming others, the ones no one else thought to remember. It's your rebellion now too. Not loud, not sharp, just steady. Because in a world that forgets as a matter of structure, to remember is to resist. You sit again. The path has curved back to the writing desk. The ink is still fresh. The page is still waiting. This time you don't hesitate. Not because you figured it all out, but because you finally understand. You don't have to. Christine didn't write from certainty. She wrote from care, from the kind of attention that refuses to let anyone vanish quietly. That's your job now, to notice, to ask, to record, not because you'll change everything, but because someone, somewhere, is waiting to feel less alone. The page is still quiet beneath your hand, but something shifts now, not in the paper, not in the pen, but in you. Until this moment, Christine's world felt like a place you visited. Now, it feels like something you've always known, like a rhythm your bones already recognized, a kind of interior architecture you were born inside but never had a name for. And now you do. Christine built it for you, not as a finished building but as scaffolding, a suggestion, a dare. You finally lower the pen and write one word, not profound, not literary, not meant to be remembered, but present. A word that plants you here in this long chain of memory between the lives that came before and the ones that will come after. Because that's what Christine was always doing, wasn't it? Linking the chain. She knew history wasn't just what survives, it's what gets continued. And she didn't care whether that happened through scholars or daughters or readers in the middle of the night. She just wanted the chain to hold. And now your hand is part of it. As you look back through the garden, through the alleys of her imaginary city, you start seeing her story less as a path and more as a weave. Her poetry, her letters, her debates, they thread through the same questions you still ask today. What does it mean to be seen? What does it cost to speak? Who gets to claim wisdom? And who is told to wait? Christine didn't give you answers. She gave you a lens. And through that lens, even the smallest things look different now. You remember how she described women's knowledge as something that lived in practice. In the way they managed households, treated wounds, told stories, solved disputes. It wasn't theoretical. It wasn't abstract. It was lived, and it was constantly undervalued. So she wrote it down. You begin to recognize how much of her work wasn't just about elevation, it was about preservation. Not glorifying women beyond their humanity, just refusing to let them vanish. And that's where her quiet rebellion becomes something larger. She didn't try to make women holy. She just tried to make them visible. That was the real revolution. You walk now past a corridor filled with silhouettes. Women from across centuries, barely distinguishable from shadow, until you realize that they're all looking toward you, not to ask for help, not to beg for memory, but to remind you they're still here, because someone like Christine chose to remember them. And now, so do you. The silence around you deepens, but not in a way that feels empty. It feels held, like walking into the long pause between chapters. Christine never wrote her final page, not really. Her last known work, The Tale of Joan of Arc, ends not with closure, but with hope. She writes of Joan's courage as something that should encourage all women. And you know what she meant. Not because she thought Joan would change everything, but because she saw in Joan what she saw in herself. The refusal to remain silent when truth was needed. You carry that now, in your language, in your work, in your questions, in your presence. You don't need a sword, or a pulpit, or a printing press. You only need a little room to speak. That's what Christine fought for. Not attention, not fame, just room. And now that she's made it for you, you find yourself wanting to make more. For others, for those who haven't been read yet, heard yet, remembered yet. You close the book, not as an ending, but as a kind of offering. A promise to keep looking backward with care, and forward with courage. Christine would call that the beginning of wisdom. The city has faded into softness now. Not gone, never gone, but translucent. Folded gently into the background of your consciousness like a melody that loops without repeating. You carry it not as a place, but as a rhythm. Something steady, low, and grounding. And Christine? She's quieter now too. She's not leading anymore. She's walking beside you. That was always her plan, wasn't it? Not to teach you what to think, but to help you recognize when something needed to be thought. When a silence felt unnatural. When a page was missing a name. When a truth was buried under centuries of convenient forgetting. You feel it in your chest now, the thing she planted, the impulse to go back and ask again. Because what Christine gave the world wasn't just her voice. It was a new reflex. A small, persistent instinct that says, wait, that can't be the whole story. And the more you look through her lens, the more you notice. You begin spotting Christine-shaped spaces everywhere. In textbooks that skip over women with a shrug. In documentaries that call a man visionary for ideas his wife shared first. In quotes marked anonymous that sound suspiciously like a woman was speaking, but no one bothered to write her name. In the moment you hesitate to speak because you're not sure it's your place. Christine has something to say about that. She'd probably raise an eyebrow, dip her pen, and scribble something in the margins of your hesitation. Nothing dramatic. Just a sharp question in beautiful script. Who benefits when you stay quiet? And you'd sit a little taller. Maybe speak a little clearer. Not because Christine is watching, but because she was watching 600 years ago and she built this space for you to stand in today. You walk again. The ground is soft. Your steps slow. Somewhere, a bell tolls, not loud, just rhythmic. Like the turning of pages. You pass a sculpture garden now. You almost missed it, so understated. Just shadows and curves lit by moonlight. No plaques. No fanfare. These are not monuments. They're placeholders. For the women Christine wrote into existence. For the ones she didn't have time to name. For the ones who were still waiting. You pause in front of one. It's unfinished, rough at the edges. The face not quite formed. Just the suggestion of a woman rising from stone. And you know why. Christine left room for you to finish it. She trusted that someone, maybe not soon, maybe not easily, would come back and finish the work. Not to complete it, just to continue it. You touch the stone. It's warm. And in that contact, a phrase from one of her letters comes back. Not one of the famous ones. A quiet line from a letter to a fellow widow. Let us not be erased by our grief. Let us shape it. That's what she did. Isn't it? Christine shaped her grief, her widowhood, her exile, her losses into architecture, into logic, into memory, into record. She turned sorrow into strategy. And that's a model too. You look up, the city flickers in the distance, not fading but transforming. No longer a medieval metaphor, no longer a dreamscape of allegory. It becomes a symbol now for every time someone carved space into a history that said you do not belong. Christine said, I do. And now you do too. You begin to retrace your steps, but they've changed. The city's not behind you anymore. It's around you, inside you. You've internalized the rhythm of her thinking, the patient gravity of her refusal to be erased. And now you carry it forward not as a replica but as a response. Because Christine never wanted echo. She wanted dialogue. She'd be the first to say, don't write like me. Write like you. Just don't stop writing. And that's the path now. Not a monument, not a lecture. Just a continuation. A thread handed off not with fanfare but with trust. You're not Christine. You're the next chapter. And somewhere, someone is waiting for your page. You return to the page, not as a reader, not even as a writer, but as something new, something Christine envisioned without ever naming. A participant in memory. One of the quiet ones. The keepers. The restorers. The slow scribes in the margins of time. That's what you are now. Not a hero. Just someone who didn't let it vanish. You sit at that long wooden table once more. There's no ceremony. No applause. Just the soft hush of wind through pages. The inkpot still waits, the paper still blank, but somehow less intimidating than before. Because you know the truth. Christine didn't start with confidence. She started with necessity. Her father's death. Her husband's loss. Her debts. The weight of survival. She didn't write because she wanted to be remembered. She wrote because she refused to be silenced by circumstance. And when she picked up her pen, she wasn't just defending women. She was defending the possibility of a woman thinking clearly, speaking plainly, and being believed. That's what still feels so modern about her. She wasn't writing about women. She was writing to them, for them, with them. And by doing so, she changed the definition of who gets to be a thinker, a builder, a documentarian of their own time. She changed the rules not with revolt, but with presence. And now it's your turn to be present. You run your fingers along the paper. Still blank. But now it doesn't feel like absence. It feels like invitation. Because that's what Christine's rebellion was built on, not noise, but naming. She named women into history. She named their talents, their arguments, their worth. She didn't need to scream. She only needed to write it down where someone else might see it later. You think of the scholars who nearly lost her. Of the decades she was ignored. The centuries where her books sat unread in damp archives. The eyes that skimmed past her name without understanding what she'd done. And still, her words survived. Because she planted them deep, in form, in reason, in rhythm. And now, 600 years later, those roots have reached you. You breathe slowly. The garden outside this imagined space fades into dawn. Birdsong in the distance, and Christine's presence now, so quiet you could almost forget she was ever here, lives in the shape of your attention. The way you hold the page. The way you look and keep looking for what the official record left out. This too is authorship. This too is a kind of writing. Christine doesn't get the last word. She never wanted it. She left that to you. So, when you finally begin writing, whether it's a sentence, a sketch, a question, or a small protest, you do it not with pressure, but with continuity. With the knowledge that memory is built one decision at a time. To include, to notice, to care, and to believe that care might reach someone else someday long after you're gone. Christine believed in you before you existed. She built the city without knowing your name. She left the gate open. She saved you a seat. You're here now, and you won't let it be erased. So now, with the ink still drying and the sky just starting to shift from velvet to gray, you ease back from the desk. There's no rush. No dramatic finale. Just a soft settling. The way breath slows when the body knows it's safe. The garden outside Christine's window hums with early silence. That pre-dawn kind where everything is awake but nothing is asking anything of you. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, it feels earned. You're not thinking about books anymore. Not even history. You're just floating. A little lighter than before. Because something about walking through her city, her thoughts, her rebellion, her ink-stained hands has changed how you carry your own. Not heavier. Not burdened. Just more aware. More held. You let your eyes close. And in the darkness behind them, the city reappears not as streets or spires, but as small, shining fragments. A torn page. A whispered name. A soft voice saying, I was here. I mattered. That's what Christine gave you. Not a lecture. Not a legacy. Presence. And you feel her presence drift just slightly beyond reach now. Not gone. Just resting. Like a book placed gently back on the shelf. Knowing you'll return to it someday. Or maybe not. Maybe you won't need to. Maybe the lesson is already woven into how you move through the world now. That's enough. That's the whole point. So breathe. Let your body soften. Let the rhythm of the fan in the corner or the soft murmur of passing time lull you. Christine is done speaking. And you've heard her. Now let the silence do the rest. Let your thoughts drift. Let your jaw unclench. Let your spine melt into the mattress. Let the pages of history close softly without needing to be explained. There is nothing you need to remember. No quiz at the end. Just this moment. This quiet. This city that never really ends. Let it hold you. Let it hush the world outside your door. You are safe. You are enough. You are written in. Good night.